I always believed I'd parted ways with my family's farmland long ago. As a child, I'd roam those rolling fields, chasing grasshoppers beneath the blazing sun, while Grandpa hollered words of encouragement from the barn. Over time, life took me away. College, a move to Kansas City, a stack of bills that needed paying. Eventually, that farmland became little more than a golden memory I'd occasionally revisit in quiet moments. Then, an unexpected letter arrived from my Aunt Loretta in Florida, claiming a newly discovered will had named me heir to Grandpa's fields. Disbelief quickly gave way to curiosity. Rifling through an old folder marked Family Farm, I unearthed letters detailing harvest seasons, tax troubles, and an unbroken tie to the land we thought was lost. If Aunt Loretta was right, that inheritance still belonged to us. And now I was responsible for it. I felt a pull to revisit the fields and uncover the truth about Grandpa's legacy. Stepping away from my desk, I tried to gather my thoughts. My first impulse was to shrug this off as an inheritance that might have been sold behind closed doors, or possibly foreclosed in some financial fiasco. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I decided I had to see the property in person. I rummaged for my truck keys, rifled through old documents in a plastic bin under my bed, and found a dusty manila folder labeled Family Farm. Inside were letters Grandpa had penned to my mother, describing a plot of farmland, references to harvesting seasons, and persistent issues with county taxes. A pang of nostalgia hit me. I remembered running along the edges of a cornfield as a small child, the sun blistering overhead, my grandpa's hearty laugh echoing around me as I chased grasshoppers along the fence line. The next morning I made the trip. Driving out of the city, I watched the buildings give way to rolling hills, farmland, and the broad open sky that always feels bigger in the Midwest. I was prepared for a scene of rural decay. An old barn leaning precariously, maybe a rusted tractor in the grass, certainly not the thriving farmland Grandpa had once described. But I wasn't prepared for what I actually found. As I turned onto the gravel road that led to the property, a polished sign rose into view. Sunnyvale Meadows, an HOA community, it read in bold, modern lettering. I slammed on the brakes and just stared. Rows of identical houses extended across what should have been acres of farmland. Where there should have been cornfields, I now saw manicured lawns, pastel-colored vinyl siding, and freshly poured. My jaw dropped in disbelief. Cautiously, I drove past the sign and onto streets with names like Harvest Lane and Maple Brook Drive, all forming a pristine suburban labyrinth. My grandfather's farmland, if this was indeed the same parcel, had vanished beneath a sea of identical homes and meticulously landscaped yards. The smell of fresh grass clippings floated in the summer air, mingling with the faint odor of asphalt. It felt as though my childhood memories had been bulldozed. I pulled over, stepping onto the sidewalk that wrapped around a tidy cul-de-sac. A few residents glanced my way, some walking dogs, others watering potted plants on their front porches. Their guarded smiles made me feel out of place, like an uninvited guest who just wandered onto a private club's premises. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Determined to learn more, I approached a middle-aged woman who was busy arranging lawn ornaments shaped like pink flamingos. She looked up startled as I asked if she knew how long the neighborhood had been here. "Oh, Sunnyvale Meadows has been around for about 6 or 7 years, she replied. "The HOA is run by Maple Bridge HOA Services. They keep everything organized." Her voice trailed off as though even she recognized that the word organized could be code for strict. I thanked her and retreated, my head swirling with questions. How was it that I'd inherited farmland, only to find an entire neighborhood built on top of it? I returned to my truck, rummaging for the documents Aunt Loretta had mailed me, comparing the property's legal description to the local street names. Every boundary line in the legal papers matched the land beneath Sunnyvale Meadows. If these documents were accurate, I was, on paper, the owner of a large chunk of real estate that was already occupied by hundreds of unsuspecting homeowners. The realization made my skin prickle. Had Grandpa sold the land to a developer without telling anyone? But why then did the will specify that it was still in our family's possession? None of this added up. A swirl of confusion kept me awake that night in my apartment. Memories of Grandpa's devotion to that farmland replayed in my mind like old film reels. He'd never have sold it so easily, especially to a large, profit-driven corporation. Something smelled fishy. I needed help, so I called Celia, a friend who worked in a big law firm downtown. I caught her up on the surreal events, from Aunt Loretta's phone call to my discovery of the HOA community. Celia was equally baffled and offered to help me dig into county records. If a fraudulent transaction had occurred, we'd find evidence of it. The following day, we met at a coffee shop near the law firm. Celia arrived with a stack of printed documents, some of which she'd pulled from the county registry. She leaned in, her eyes flicking over each page. "You're not crazy," she said, tapping a document that looked like a copy of a deed transfer. "It appears there's a record of your grandfather's farmland transferring to a corporation called Benson Fairchild Land Co. about 8 years ago. But look," she said, flipping to a notary signature. "The date is suspicious. The notary listed here died several years before this was supposedly signed." My stomach dropped. "If this is forged, it's a serious crime," Celia continued. "And the corporation's mailing address? It's a P.O. box in another state. We'll have to keep digging." As days turned into weeks, the puzzle pieces fell into place. Benson Fairchild Land Co. turned out to be a shell entity with murky ties to Maplebridge HOA Services, the same organization that managed Sunnyvale Meadows. Court filings in other states hinted at a pattern of unscrupulous land acquisitions. Armed with this information, I felt a surge of anger. My family's farmland had been stolen and then flipped into a sprawling neighborhood for hefty profit. All of this had been hidden behind fraudulent paperwork that made it appear legitimate. Meanwhile, hundreds of families had unknowingly bought homes on illegally obtained land, trusting the developer's sales pitch about a safe, regulated community. I decided to take the next step. With Celia's guidance, I reached out to a real estate litigation attorney named Kevin Arnold. I'll never forget our first meeting in his dimly lit office. Legal tomes lined every wall, and Kevin greeted me with a firm handshake, adopting an air of practiced calm. I laid out everything I knew, from Grandpa's will to the suspicious deed transfers. Kevin's jaw clenched when I showed him the forged notary stamp. "This is brazen," he commented, "and Maplebridge is not a small player. They'll fight tooth and nail to keep this quiet." He wasn't exaggerating. Once we filed the lawsuit, Maplebridge's legal team responded with denial and threatened to countersue for defamation, hoping to scare me into dropping the case. But my mind was set. Grandpa's farmland might have been replaced by suburban houses, but I wasn't about to let a giant corporation walk away scot-free. I felt in my gut that if I backed down now, I'd be betraying not just Grandpa's memory, but every principle he stood for. Months passed in a blur of depositions, court filings, and nerve-wracking conferences. Kevin advised me to avoid direct contact with residents of Sunnyvale Meadows, emphasizing that they'd be used as pawns in Maplebridge's strategy to paint me as the villain who wanted to rip away their homes. His words proved prophetic. Social media posts soon labeled me as a heartless opportunist, implying I was more interested in money than in the people's well-being. Some residents, terrified by rumors they might lose their homes, lashed out at me online. My phone buzzed with hateful messages, and I caught whispered comments calling me greedy. It stung, because I had no interest in punishing innocent families. My goal was to expose Maplebridge's wrongdoing and reclaim the farmland that was rightfully my family's. But Maplebridge's PR machine was well-oiled, and I found myself cast as a corporate Goliath, even though I was just a single individual trying to stand up for justice. Tensions mounted in my personal life as well. Aunt Loretta, the only other relative closely tracking the case, called me daily from Florida. She worried about the emotional toll it was taking on me. She also lamented the day she discovered that Will— "I had no idea, sweetie," she would say with regret in her voice. "I never wanted this to become a nightmare. I just thought you should know your grandfather wanted you to have that land." I assured her I had no regrets about pursuing the truth, but a piece of me did wonder if my life might have been simpler if I'd never unearthed this entire saga. Late at night, I'd sometimes stare at the ceiling, plagued by doubts. Maple Bridge was a heavyweight with powerful attorneys who might bury me in legal costs and paperwork. Yet, every time I doubted myself, I remembered Grandpa's stories. Those golden fields at sunset, the orchard he once tended, the barn dances he mentioned in his diaries. I couldn't let a fraudulent corporation just wipe that legacy off the map. If there was a glimmer of hope, it came from unexpected allies within Sunnyvale Meadows. A few residents, disgruntled with the HOA for their stringent regulations and constant hikes in fees, secretly reached out. One woman, who introduced herself as Wendy, confessed that she was tired of being nickel and dimed for every little thing. Painting her shutters a slightly off-approved color, installing a small bird bath in her yard without advance permission, and so on. She told me the HOA rules felt oppressive, especially since Maple Bridge still exerted control over aspects of the community's finances. While she remained worried about losing her home, she also wanted to see Maple Bridge answer for any wrongdoing. We spoke on the phone several times, me carefully abiding by Kevin's instructions not to promise her anything regarding the legal outcome. Wendy's empathy and frustration at least soothed the sting of so many other residents' hostility. It also offered me valuable insights into how the neighborhood functioned and how Maple Bridge had built its fortress of control. All of this fueled a deeper investigation. Celia, on her own time, uncovered clues that Maple Bridge routinely used shell companies to acquire large tracts of land, typically farmland just outside city limits. These acquisitions were often followed by rapid development. After the houses sold, Maple Bridge installed an HOA that it effectively dominated, funneling revenue through fees and fines. Then, in many cases, Maple Bridge quietly handed control over to a separate management firm, also owned by them. It was a cyclical process that left homeowners paying ever-increasing dues. In the county registry, we found repeated patterns of forged notary stamps and suspicious chain of title documents. It was a sprawling scam. I realized my grandfather's land wasn't the only victim, though it was a particularly brazen case, because the farmland had never been sold legitimately by any living member of my family. The legal path to trial was grueling, involving pre-trial motions, discovery, and depositions that tested my patience. Sometimes, Maple Bridge's attorneys tried to trip me up by suggesting that maybe Grandpa had verbally agreed to sell the land. They brandished incomplete documents that they claimed might be promissory notes or letters of intent. Yet those were riddled with inconsistencies, false signatures, and bizarre references to a time after Grandpa's death. It was like stepping into a labyrinth of lies, each turn more disorienting than the last. Kevin and Celia kept me grounded, reminding me to stick to the facts. The will clearly stated Grandpa had never sold the land, and the chain of title records were riddled with forgery. That was the core of our case. About 3 months before the official trial date, something extraordinary happened. A local news channel picked up the story. Perhaps they heard rumors of the farmland fiasco, or maybe they noticed the unusual volume of real estate litigation in the county. Either way, a reporter named Alicia Tan reached out for an interview. After consulting Kevin, I agreed cautiously. If Maple Bridge could control the narrative unopposed, it might sway public opinion too strongly. By sharing documented evidence of the forgeries, I hoped to tip the scale back in my favor. Alicia turned out to be a compassionate interviewer, asking thoughtful questions about my childhood memories and my desire to preserve Grandpa's legacy. I stressed that the homeowners were not my enemies and that I had no intention of displacing innocent families. My only target was the fraud committed by Maple Bridge and its subsidiary. The interview aired on a Tuesday night. It opened with footage of a lonely stretch of farmland, a battered red barn in the distance, then cut to crisp drone shots of Sunnyvale Meadows, a swirl of identical rooftops. Alicia's narration explained the conflict, describing how an alleged paper trail of lies had turned farmland into suburban sprawl without the rightful owner's knowledge. My segment included a brief snippet of me, eyes anxious but voice steady, explaining that justice wasn't just about money, but about correcting a fundamental wrong. The piece concluded with Maple Bridge's spokesperson dismissing me as an opportunist. Nevertheless, the reaction was powerful. My phone lit up with messages of support. Emails poured in from people who had faced similar but smaller-scale issues. "Go get 'em," one message read. Another said, "Don't let these developers trample on the little guy." It was invigorating, a surge of public validation. At the same time, the interview triggered new tensions in Sunnyvale Meadows. Rumors swirled on social media that the entire community might be bulldozed if I won. Maple Bridge's reps poured gasoline on those fears, releasing statements implying that a legal victory for me would cause every homeowner's title to be questionable. Their intention was transparent: turn the residents into an angry mob so they'd close ranks against me. The gambit worked to some extent. A neighbor of Wendy's, a man named Martin, who was active on the community's social media page, repeatedly labeled me the farmland tyrant. I tried not to let it get to me, reminding myself that these people had been misled too. A couple of months before the trial, a vital piece of evidence fell into our hands. Celia's sleuthing uncovered internal emails from a Maple Bridge executive. One email plainly stated concerns over the authenticity of that farmland deed. The executive asked whether the notary stamp would hold up under scrutiny. Another manager replied that they should keep the matter as quiet as possible for fear of major financial repercussions. It was a smoking gun, proof that Maple Bridge was aware of the fraudulent nature of the deed well before the farmland was developed. Kevin practically jumped for joy when he saw this. "They're cooked," he declared, reminding me that direct evidence of prior knowledge is often the linchpin in a fraud case. But Maple Bridge didn't give up. They tried everything to get the emails ruled inadmissible, claiming they'd been obtained illegally. Celia, who was not bound by certain investigative restrictions as she was only assisting as a friend, had actually received them from an anonymous whistleblower. Kevin's team meticulously documented how the emails were provided voluntarily by someone with legitimate access. The judge ruled in our favor after a contentious hearing. Maple Bridge's attorneys glowered at me in the hallway as we left the courtroom. I recognized their message: this isn't over. The trial date arrived at last, nearly a year from the day I'd discovered that sign for Sunnyvale Meadows. My nerves were electrified, bracing for the biggest fight of my life. Outside the courthouse, a small group of homeowners and local reporters had gathered, forming a chaotic scene of tension and curiosity. I spotted Wendy in the crowd. She nodded encouragingly. I also saw Martin, who gave me a cold stare, as though I were personally repossessing his home right then and there. Cameras flashed, and I tried to maintain composure, reminding myself that once we stepped into the courtroom, it all came down to evidence and arguments. The judge was a gruff woman named Judge Maxwell, known for her no-nonsense demeanor. She set the tone immediately, insisting on decorum and warning both sides that theatrics wouldn't sway her. Maple Bridge's legal team called me to the stand early, attempting to paint me as an absentee heir who only appeared when he smelled money. Their lead attorney, a slick man named Camden, grilled me on why I'd waited so many years to claim the land. I explained that I hadn't known about the will until my aunt found it, that I had zero knowledge of any fraudulent transactions prior to stumbling upon the fully built neighborhood. Camden tried to pick apart my story, suggesting maybe Grandpa had, at some point, verbally agreed to a partial sale. Kevin objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained, admonishing Camden to stick to the documented facts. Then our side presented the chain of title analysis, complete with expert testimony from a forensic document examiner. She pointed out the forged signature, the suspicious notary stamp, and the improbable timeline. The more details she revealed, the more restless Maple Bridge's attorneys appeared. Kevin then summoned the county clerk, who validated that no legitimate transfer from my grandfather to Benson Fairchild Land Co. had ever been recorded. The star moment, however, was the introduction of those internal emails. The hush that fell over the courtroom was palpable. We read excerpts aloud, revealing how Maple Bridge's higher-ups had explicitly questioned the authenticity of the farmland deed long before finalizing any development. The evidence left Maple Bridge's defense in a precarious position. After our presentation, Maple Bridge called a series of witnesses. They put residents from Sunnyvale Meadows on the stand, each tearfully describing their fear of losing their homes. While my heart ached for them, Kevin reminded the judge that these folks were not the ones we were suing, they were victims too. Maple Bridge's strategy was to appeal to emotional sympathy. Next, they brought out a mid-level manager who claimed ignorance of any title issues, portraying Maple Bridge as an honest developer who had simply been duped by a shady landowner. That's when Kevin struck back, presenting evidence that the manager had received at least one of those emails referencing the forgery. The manager squirmed on the stand, stumbling through vague explanations. The tension reached a boiling point when Maple Bridge's lead counsel tried to pivot, implicating the homeowners themselves. They suggested that if the deed was invalid, then the entire chain of property sales might be invalid. The judge shot him a cold stare, reminding him that the central question was Maple Bridge's potential fraud, not the homeowner's culpability. Unfazed, Maple Bridge's attorney hammered on the theme that I was effectively coming for people's homes. Hoping to land an emotional blow, Kevin objected strongly, clarifying that we sought damages from Maple Bridge and restitution for the unlawful taking of my land, not to uproot the residents. Nonetheless, the atmosphere in the courtroom crackled with anxiety. Each day after leaving the courthouse, I felt drained, physically and emotionally. Yet I also felt a growing sense of determination. As the trial progressed, more media outlets covered the story. Some anchored their segments around the question, could this happen in your neighborhood? It struck a chord with viewers who were no strangers to rising HOA fees and manipulative developers. My phone buzzed endlessly, with reporters requesting statements, nonprofits offering support, and random well-wishers urging me to keep fighting. I tried to stay focused. In a conversation with Aunt Loretta late one evening, she tearfully thanked me for protecting Grandpa's honor. Her words fueled me on the darkest nights. After nearly 4 weeks, final arguments commenced. Kevin rose, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the jury. Though this was technically a bench trial, he addressed the judge with the same care he would a jury. He spoke with conviction about the forensic evidence, the chain of title irregularities, and Maple Bridge's internal emails. Your Honor, this isn't a simple misunderstanding, he concluded. It's a deliberate act to steal land and profit off that theft. My client only discovered the fraud by sheer chance. Had it gone unnoticed, Maple Bridge would have continued to collect profits, while a trusting community of homeowners remained ignorant of the shaky foundation beneath them. He paused, letting the words sink in. We ask this court to acknowledge the true ownership of the farmland, hold Maple Bridge accountable for its actions, and ensure that justice is done not just for my client, but for every family at Sunnyvale Meadows who was misled. Camden, Maple Bridge's lead attorney, delivered his closing argument with theatrics. He gestured toward me, painting me as an opportunist seeking millions in windfall at the expense of innocent homeowners. He conceded the possibility of forged documents, but insisted Maple Bridge was unaware of the forgeries, shifting blame to the defunct Benson Fairchild Land Co. He hammered on the equity argument, urging the judge to weigh the dire consequences for the homeowners if the land reverted to me free and clear. We cannot place the entire burden of a vanished corporation's misdeeds on Maple Bridge, or on these unsuspecting residents, he concluded. Days passed in excruciating suspense. The judge promised a written decision. I spent that time tying up loose ends with Celia and Kevin, preparing for all possible outcomes. Maybe the judge would side with Maple Bridge, concluding the evidence wasn't enough to prove their intentional fraud. Perhaps she'd rule partially in our favor, awarding damages but stopping short of restoring the land to my ownership. In my most hopeful scenario, the judge would acknowledge the land was rightfully ours from the start, forcing Maplebridge to compensate me for their illegal development. Late at night, I'd lie awake wondering if my stance truly protected Grandpa's legacy, or if it would irreparably divide me from a community that, in many ways, was also victimized. Finally, on a crisp October morning, the judgment arrived. Kevin called me before I'd even had breakfast, his voice trembling with anticipation. "The judge ruled," he said. "She found in our favor." A rush of relief coursed through my body, but I urged him to read me the details. Her opinion was thorough. She declared the farmland deed to Benson Fairchild Land Co. fraudulent and void, meaning the farmland had never left my grandfather's estate. Maplebridge, she concluded, either knew or should have known about the forgeries, yet proceeded with the development. As a result, the court ordered Maplebridge to pay substantial damages to me, essentially the estimated market value of the land plus punitive damages for the fraud. However, in a nuanced move, the judge provided that current homeowners' property titles would not be automatically voided as long as they acted in good faith. Instead, Maplebridge was required to set up a restitution fund under court supervision to address any future title claims or to reimburse homeowners who wished to renegotiate or sell. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath. This was the outcome I'd prayed for, balancing the scales of justice without uprooting families from their houses. Reporters pounced on the story, hailing it as a landmark decision against shady HOAs and corporate developers. Maplebridge immediately filed appeals, denouncing the judgment as unjust and harmful to our communities, but they had lost the first round decisively. My phone buzzed nonstop that day. Calls from journalists, from supportive neighbors, from distant cousins who hadn't contacted me in years. Even Wendy reached out, her voice shaking with what sounded like a mixture of relief and fear. "Are we safe?" she asked. "I don't want to move." I assured her that the judge's ruling protected the homeowners, emphasizing that Maplebridge, not the residents, would bear the financial burden. In the months following the verdict, the dust began to settle. Or more accurately, it began to swirl in new ways. Maplebridge's appeal trudged along, but the media scrutiny revealed other suspicious deals in adjacent counties. It turned out that the farmland fiasco was just the tip of an iceberg. Several other lawsuits sprang up, with plaintiffs claiming Maplebridge had engaged in shady land transfers and inflated HOA fees that vanished into shell accounts. Criminal investigations loomed. One by one, Maplebridge's top executives resigned or were indicted. The fortress was crumbling from within. The restitution fund mandated by the court brought some measure of relief to Sunnyvale Meadows homeowners. Title insurance companies stepped in, complicated legal forms were filled out, but no one was forced out. A few families did move on, citing the stress of living in a place with such a tumultuous backstory. Others stayed, forging a tighter, knit community with the HOA's oppressive oversight drastically reduced. I found myself in a morally intricate situation. According to the court's ruling, the farmland was still legally mine, or at least I had the right to enforce that ownership, but how could I, in good conscience, reclaim property already bristling with homes and families? True, I'd been awarded damages, which helped me financially, but that didn't diminish the sentimental weight of the land itself. For a while, I considered leaving it as is, letting the homeowners remain in peace. But part of Grandpa's acreage hadn't been developed, the portion Maplebridge had used as a buffer zone or simply hadn't gotten around to. That part was still farmland, though mostly overgrown. I decided to focus my energy there, channeling Grandpa's spirit of stewardship. Over the next year, I engaged with local farm associations and nonprofits. Together we planned a small-scale revival of that farmland, intending to grow organic produce and possibly establish a community garden. When word spread about my initiative, something remarkable happened. Several Sunnyvale Meadows residents expressed interest in taking part. Parents hoped to teach their kids about farming. Retirees saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with nature. Even Martin, once my staunchest critic, showed up to a planning meeting, looking sheepish but curious. I welcomed them all. If we couldn't turn back time to the era of Grandpa's wide-open fields, at least we could honor his love for the land. With Kevin's legal counsel, I hammered out a lease agreement allowing a new homeowners association, formed by the actual residents, not Maple Bridge, to use portions of the farmland for communal green space and gardens. In exchange, they agreed to maintain the land responsibly, respecting certain environmental guidelines. The arrangement felt poetic, transforming a site of corporate greed into a hub for community collaboration. Meanwhile, Maple Bridge's meltdown continued. Their appeals dragged on, but the higher courts affirmed the lower court's ruling, upholding the fraud verdict and the restitution framework. By then, the once powerful developer's reputation was in tatters, and they faced massive liability. Throughout this period, I'd occasionally be contacted by the press, asked for updates on how it felt to have won against a corporate giant. My response was always nuanced. I explained that while I was glad justice had been served, it was never about crushing Maple Bridge or punishing families. It was about honoring my grandfather's legacy and ensuring the rightful owners retained their heritage. My day-to-day life had changed too. With the awarded damages, I could afford to move closer to the farmland, which I did. I bought a modest house in a nearby town so I could oversee the farmland's new direction and be there in person for the community garden events. On weekends, I'd roam what was left of the open fields, imagining Grandpa walking beside me. Sometimes I swore I could still hear his hearty laughter on the wind. Despite the resolution, not every thread of conflict was neatly tied off. Some homeowners felt lingering bitterness toward me, resenting the legal battle that had stirred up so much anxiety. A few homes in Sunnyvale Meadows had trouble selling because prospective buyers were spooked by the development's tumultuous history. I fielded a handful of accusatory messages from homeowners insisting that I should do more to fix these issues. I understood their frustration, but also recognized that Maple Bridge's fraud had set these wheels in motion, not me. Over time, those resentments eased as the restitution fund addressed most title concerns, and the scandal faded from the headlines. New residents moved in, often drawn by the unique story of farmland that had become an unlikely community. One afternoon, I was tending a small patch of tomatoes in the community garden when a boy of about 9 years old approached. His family had moved into Sunnyvale Meadows earlier that year. He'd heard the rumors about me, some version of a land hero, I guess. Wide-eyed, he asked if I really used to play on this land when it was a farm. I chuckled and said, yes, when I was around his age, I would chase grasshoppers right around where the asphalt now covered the road. His grin lit up his face. Then he asked a question that nearly choked me up. Do you think your grandpa would be mad at us for building houses here? I felt my throat tighten. With a gentle smile, I told him that Grandpa loved sharing his land, as long as people cared for it. Then we walked to a row of peppers, and I showed him how to gently check if they were ripe. Over time, I realized that for all the anger and confusion, what emerged from the conflict was a kind of renaissance, a chance to unite people around a deeper purpose. The farmland wasn't returned to its original uninhabited state, but it began fostering a collective spirit of responsibility. Neighborhood potlucks replaced some of the tension. Families grew closer, planting flowers along shared walkways. Where Maple Bridge once loomed over the community with draconian rules, a resident-led council took shape, focusing on actual neighborhood needs. They installed better playgrounds, organized holiday events, and started a monthly newsletter, which included updates on the farmland project. It became a shining example of how an HOA could serve rather than oppress. Meanwhile, the legal world took notice of the victory. Kevin received multiple invitations to speak at real estate law conferences, analyzing the case as a turning point in battles against fraudulent developments. Celia, for her part, was promoted within her firm for her investigative prowess, eventually leading her own real estate fraud division. I jokingly called her the Sherlock of shady deeds, and she wore the nickname proudly. Our friendship deepened in the crucible of this ordeal. I also felt for the first time in my adult life that I was part of something bigger, something meaningful that could help protect other families from the heartbreak my family and the residents had experienced. A year after the final appeal was settled, I received an invitation to speak at a local civic group. They wanted me to share my experience, how a seemingly ordinary individual could stand up against corporate wrongdoing. I was hesitant at first, never having seen myself as a public speaker. But I accepted, hoping to shed light on the personal stakes behind what many saw as a sensational courtroom drama. On the evening of the event, I found myself in a community center auditorium facing an attentive crowd of maybe 100 people. As I spoke, I recounted Grandpa's devotion to the land, the heartbreak of seeing Sunnyvale Meadows for the first time, and the grueling legal process that ensued. I emphasized that the real victory lay not in punishing Maple Bridge, but in restoring fairness and forging a path for the families to remain. My voice trembled at times, remembering the emotional toll. Yet I felt a swell of gratitude. If my story could inspire others to question suspicious developments or stand up against fraud, perhaps Grandpa's spirit truly lived on in that farmland. Afterward, a line of people formed to shake my hand, share their own stories, or simply thank me. One older man described how he'd faced a similar problem on a smaller scale, a neighbor encroaching on his land with a fence that was 2 feet over the property line. He said my courage gave him the confidence to insist on a proper survey and correct the boundary. Another young woman expressed relief at knowing she wasn't alone in dealing with an overpowering HOA that once threatened her family with liens over minor infractions. I listened, nodding, offering empathy where I could. In each story, I heard echoes of the same desire. People just wanted fairness, a sense that their rights were respected, and that large organizations couldn't steamroll them without accountability. Stepping outside the community center into the brisk evening air, I gazed up at the moonlit sky. It struck me how life can pivot on tiny moments, a phone call, an unexpected document, a friend's discovery. Those pivot points can lead to chaos, but they can also open doors to growth. My life had changed drastically since the day Aunt Loretta called. I'd gone from a solitary desk job to become a reluctant activist, a caretaker of farmland, a defendant, and ultimately, a victor in a lawsuit that tested every emotional fiber I had. And in many ways, the fight wasn't solely about the land. It was about identity, memory, justice, and the communal bonds that unite us when we refuse to let deception have the last word. Even now, with Maple Bridge essentially dismantled and the farmland partially restored to a communal resource, I occasionally sense Grandpa's presence most vividly when I'm at the edge of the property line. There's a spot where the houses end and a large oak tree stands, its branches extending like a protective canopy. Grandpa once mentioned that tree in an old diary entry, calling it the Sentinel because it had stood through storms and droughts, silently watching over the fields. I often pause there, letting my hand rest against the rough bark, hearing the echoes of cicadas and rustling leaves. In those moments, the bitterness of the legal battles fades. I'm left with an abiding gratitude for the land, for the chance to safeguard it, and for the surprising alliances forged along the way. If there's one overarching lesson that resonates through it all, it's that truth and tenacity can dismantle the mightiest of facades. Maple Bridge was no small-time operation. They had deep pockets, complex corporate structures, and a knack for silencing critics. But a single determined individual, bolstered by loyal friends and a resolute attorney, can peel back those layers of deception. It takes courage and, yes, a willingness to face public scrutiny and legal intimidation. There were days I thought about quitting, nights when I could barely sleep. Yet remembering my grandfather's integrity kept me anchored. He was an honest man, always quick to lend a hand, slow to judge, and respectful of the land that gave life to our family. Allowing Maple Bridge to get away with theft would have betrayed his memory and the values he taught. In the aftermath, many residents of Sunnyvale Meadows voiced relief that the entire fiasco shone a spotlight on their community. While the original developer had committed fraud, the result was a reinvigorated sense of purpose among neighbors. Freed from the draconian constraints of Maple Bridge's HOA, they established a more democratic association. Wendy and Martin ended up co-chairing a gardening committee, ironically bridging their once polarized views. Street parties replaced some of the formal gatherings the old HOA used to host, and folks found they appreciated the farmland's presence, especially with a portion now dedicated to a living museum of sorts, showcasing local farming practices and wildlife conservation. School groups from surrounding areas came to learn about sustainable agriculture, orchard management, and the importance of preventing corporate fraud. Looking out at the scene one sunny afternoon, I noticed families picnicking near a restored barn, kids chasing each other, and local volunteers teaching them how to plant seedlings in neat rows. It was as though a piece of Grandpa's dream, the unity and joy of honest farm life, had found a second life here. Of course, not every story tied up with a neat bow. Some homeowners, spooked by the publicity, chose to sell and move to quieter suburbs. I understood their decision. The fiasco had left emotional scars, and while the judge's ruling made it clear their titles were safe, some folks just didn't want the association with scandal. Now and then, local realtors still mention the farmland case, but it's increasingly referred to as a success story, an instance where justice prevailed and a community emerged stronger. Part of me finds solace in that narrative, yet I also remember the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the sense of betrayal that fueled my determination. None of this was easy. I also fielded inquiries from environmental organizations that wanted to use the farmland restoration as a template for urban edge farmland management. They recognize that as cities expand, farmland is often the first casualty, sold off for subdivisions. Our story offered a different perspective. Farmland can coexist with residential areas and even enhance the quality of life for residents. With the restitution money, I partnered with a local conservation group to replant a small orchard, apple and cherry trees like Grandpa once nurtured. 2 springs after the judgment, those saplings blossomed, and the orchard was a delicate spectacle of pink and white petals. Families came to watch, marveling at how quickly nature could rebound when given a chance. During one of these orchard visits, I met an elderly gentleman who told me he'd known my grandfather years ago, having purchased feed from him on multiple occasions. He praised Grandpa's fairness, recounting how Grandpa had once forgiven a debt during a particularly bad drought. Hearing another person affirm Grandpa's kindness lifted my spirits. We walked among the saplings, and at one point he tapped his cane on the ground, remarking, "Your grandpa would be proud of you." Tears stung my eyes. I smiled, silently thanking the forces that had nudged me down this path, no matter how tumultuous it had been. In time, Maple Bridge's name became synonymous with corporate fraud in local news coverage. Their brand was toxic. Their executives resigned or faced charges, and competing developers swooped in to fill the vacuum. While it was tempting to celebrate their downfall, I tried to remain humble. This hadn't been a game of revenge. It was about justice and safeguarding a legacy. Maple Bridge's demise was a natural consequence of its own unethical schemes, and though they tried multiple avenues of appeal, each higher court affirmed the original judgment, driving the final nail into their coffin. Occasionally, people ask me if I would do it all again. Did the fight cost too much, financially, emotionally, psychologically? On some mornings, I might hesitate. The stress weighed on me heavily. Yet the overarching truth is this: I would do it again in a heartbeat. Because the farmland was never just about real estate. It was a living symbol of my family history and the kind of honesty Grandpa embodied. Surrendering to fraud would have meant letting a brazen injustice stand, not just for me, but for any small landowner who lacks the means or courage to fight back. In resisting Maple Bridge's might, I found a sense of purpose and discovered a network of supportive allies, from Celia's tireless research to Kevin's unwavering legal guidance to the handful of neighbors who recognized that our struggles were deeply entwined. Today, if you wander out to Sunnyvale Meadows, you'll see a neighborhood that might look at first glance like many others. Houses lined up in neat rows, driveways dotted with cars, kids playing basketball in cul-de-sacs. But if you venture a little deeper, you'll find a vibrant community garden bursting with tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs, and flowers. You'll notice a path that leads to a partially wooded area where that grand oak tree stands sentinel near the orchard. You'll see benches carved with inscriptions about the land's history, tributes to my grandfather and the families who joined together after the scandal. If you visit on a weekend, you might catch a small farmer's market with residents selling produce they grew themselves. There's laughter, shared recipes, and conversation about sustainable living in the distance. The orchard blossoms in spring and yields fruit in the fall, children running between the rows of trees, learning how to pick apples without bruising them. Even the architecture now has small personal touches. Some fences are painted cheerful colors, flower pots adorn front steps, and you no longer see those uniform mailboxes that once symbolized the HOA's iron grip. Standing at the edge of this revitalized land, I think back to the day I first saw the Sunnyvale Meadows, an HOA community sign. My heart sank back then, assuming all was lost. But the journey that followed taught me about the power of perseverance, the complexity of justice, and the resilience of a community when it confronts the truth. It taught me that yes, corruption can thrive in the shadows, hidden by official stamps and corporate doublespeak, but it crumbles under the bright light of scrutiny. It also taught me that while the legal system can be slow and grueling, it can, in the right hands, deliver fairness. When people ask me for the moral of my story, I offer them this. Never underestimate your ability to make a difference, even if you're just one person facing a seemingly unassailable force. Armed with evidence, determination, and the right allies, you can hold wrongdoers accountable, and perhaps more importantly, you can transform a narrative of theft and deceit into one of renewal and cooperation. My grandfather's fields may not look the way they did decades ago, but their spirit endures in the orchard, the community garden, and the neighborly bonds that arose from adversity. That transformation, that rebirth of the land and the people on it, is the deepest testament to the idea that truth and compassion can triumph over greed. I often imagine how Grandpa would react if he could walk these fields again. I picture him tipping his old hat, smiling at the orchard, greeting the neighbors, maybe chuckling to see the modern houses where rows of corn once stood. Knowing him, I suspect he'd say something like, "Well, times change, but as long as folks take care of the land and each other, we're doing all right." And I believe that's the real legacy, caring for one another, protecting what's important, and refusing to let injustice go unchallenged, no matter how daunting the fight seems. Because in the end, the land doesn't belong solely to those who hold the deed. It belongs to the generations who poured their love into it, to the communities who cultivate it, and to the future that will inevitably spring from its soil. My victory in court proved that Maple Bridge had no right to steal my grandfather's fields through forgery and deceit, yet the triumph was more than a legal decree. It was the restoration of an inheritance that was always more than acreage. It was about dignity, memory, and the willingness to grow something beautiful amid the wreckage left by greed. If that's not worth fighting for, I don't know what is. And so the profound lesson I want to share is this. True justice isn't just about winning a case. It's about restoring balance, nurturing empathy, and ensuring that, even when we stand alone against formidable odds, our commitment to integrity can unite us and transform what was once a stolen dream into a living testament of hope.